When you think of the world's ultimate military superpower, the United States instantly comes to mind. But the true backbone of that jaw-dropping might? It's the undisputed, overwhelming scale of the U.S. Navy. How exactly did America build such an unstoppable maritime force? Welcome back to Flat Archive. Even amid today's fierce tensions simmering in the Pacific, no one can deny that U.S. naval power maintains an overwhelming edge. When you picture American military might, what's the first iconic image that pops into your head? The movie Top Gun Maverick, right? That's the U.S. Navy. The truth is, the U.S. Navy has held the undisputed #1 spot in the world for a very long time. Back in the day, naval dominance was all about the era of battleships and big guns, but at the heart of modern American naval supremacy is without a doubt the aircraft carrier. According to the World Directory of Modern Military Warships, the United States Navy currently boasts an awe-inspiring fleet of 11 aircraft carriers, 68 submarines, 9 cruisers, and 76 destroyers, giving them a staggering operational capacity. But when it comes to naval fleets, it's not just a numbers game. The quality of those ships is absolutely crucial. You have to factor in how well they are armed with cutting-edge tech, their level of modernization, and the scale of their logistical support networks. In particular, a warship's displacement is considered a critical metric. The larger the displacement, the more weapons and fighter jets it can naturally carry, the further out into the ocean it can operate, and the more crew it can accommodate. By tonnage alone, the United States is in a league of its own, roughly 2.5 times larger than the runner-up, China. America's geopolitical location makes prioritizing the Navy a no-brainer. Unless neighboring Canada or Mexico suddenly go completely rogue, a direct overland invasion of the U.S. mainland is practically impossible. Therefore, building up naval power to defend its 3 surrounding coastlines and using those oceans to project power globally is an absolute necessity. When tracing the roots of this mighty naval force, there is one core figure we absolutely cannot leave out. That is the 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was actually serving as Vice President under the William McKinley administration. However, shortly after McKinley's second term began, he was tragically assassinated. Thrust into the Oval Office by this tragedy, Vice President Roosevelt assumed the presidency at the incredibly young age of 42. To this day, he firmly holds the record as the youngest president in U.S. history. Though young, his political resume was rock solid. He had served as a New York State Assemblyman, Governor of New York, Vice President, and eventually Commander-in-Chief. If you were to pick the ultimate president who perfectly embodied America's rugged individualism, the most stereotypically macho American president, I'd point to Theodore Roosevelt without a second thought. True to his famously championed philosophy of the strenuous life, he was a fearless, trailblazing leader who pushed forward like a bulldozer. Another defining trait of President Roosevelt was his absolute, undeniable love for the Navy. He dreamed of a militarily powerful America, and he held a fierce conviction that a dominant Navy was the prerequisite for that dream. Driven by this passion, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work building the blue water Navy he had always envisioned. Then, a pivotal event occurred that catapulted Roosevelt into national political stardom overnight. That was the outbreak of the Spanish-American War in 1898. At the time, the imperial power of Spain was waning, and the Latin American colonies it had built during the Age of Discovery were facing independence or being sold off one by one. In the midst of this, in 1895, Cuba launched the massive war for independence it so desperately craved. Secretly, the U.S. was hoping for this exact scenario behind the scenes, but they had one major concern. The undisputed global naval superpower of the time, Great Britain, and the rising naval power of Germany were both eyeing Latin America like hawks. So the U.S. was waiting for the perfect pretext to intervene, and right on cue in 1898, a massive incident provided exactly that. President McKinley had sent the battleship USS Maine to Havana, Cuba, to evacuate American citizens residing there. But in a shocking turn of events, this warship sank in Havana Harbor following a massive, unexplained explosion. Of the over 350 crew members on board, 261 lost their lives in the catastrophe. Spain vehemently denied any involvement, and while the U.S. government didn't officially point the finger at Spain right away, they insisted it was a deliberate attack. Meanwhile, the American press went into a frenzy, churning out sensationalized articles blaming the Spanish, and public demand for immediate war reached a boiling point with the slogan, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Naturally, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt was among the loudest voices advocating for war. And eventually, the U.S. declared war on Spain. But here's where Theodore Roosevelt abruptly resigned from his high-ranking post at the Navy Department. He quit so he could go fight on the front lines himself. He then personally organized a volunteer cavalry regiment known as the Rough Riders. The entire nation was turned upside down by the news that a top-tier government official and a wealthy scion of an elite East Coast family was picking up a rifle to fight for his country. People from all walks of life flocked from across the nation in droves to enlist alongside him. Roosevelt led his men ashore in Cuba, engaging in fierce combat and securing a hard-fought, glorious victory. This very deployment instantly transformed Theodore Roosevelt into a national hero and a political superstar. The outcome of the war, of course, was an overwhelming victory for the United States. America didn't stop there. As spoils of war, they claimed Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. Turning their gaze toward the Pacific, they also took control of the Philippines in Asia. If you've studied international relations, you've likely heard of his famous diplomatic policy, the Roosevelt Corollary. It was a declaration that the United States would act as the police power over the Americas. But what's truly fascinating is a chillingly prescient observation President Roosevelt made back then. The coming era will not be dominated by the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and the Americas, but by the Pacific Ocean. Therefore, Japan, China, and the United States will have to fiercely compete over this Pacific. Looking at the brutal competition with Japan during the Pacific War and the current intense hegemonic rivalry we are seeing with China, it's clear he possessed an incredibly long-term vision and a profound understanding of maritime geopolitics. The most famous event where President Roosevelt flaunted America's mighty naval power and majesty to the world was the voyage of the Great White Fleet. Even after becoming president, he continued to relentlessly expand this naval power. To broadcast this monumental achievement, he ordered the main battle fleet of the U.S. Navy to circumnavigate the globe. In a way, it was an open declaration to the world. America is no longer a peripheral nation. We have grown into a rightful world power, and we are now embarking on a full-blown expansionist strategy. Consisting of 16 cutting-edge, steel-hulled battleships painted a dazzling white alongside numerous auxiliary vessels, this massive armada formed 2 squadrons and sailed across every corner of the world's oceans. This colossal show of force proved highly effective. Historical analysis suggests it served to deflate the ego of the Empire of Japan, a nation feeling incredibly cocky after back-to-back victories in the Sino-Japanese and Russo-Japanese wars by showing them America's overwhelming firepower. There are also records indicating that Australia, upon witnessing the fleet's majesty firsthand, was deeply awestruck and strongly motivated, realizing, we need to rapidly expand our own naval power. Another prime example showing President Roosevelt's deep grasp of maritime-focused geopolitics was the construction of the Panama Canal. Arguing that American warships and merchant vessels needed to transit rapidly between the Pacific and the Atlantic, he forcefully pushed forward with this massive canal project, which seemed borderline reckless at the time. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the Frenchman who had successfully spearheaded the Suez Canal in Egypt, had actually tried his hand at this Panama Canal project previously, but Lesseps retreated after a disastrous failure plagued by disease and financial ruin, and President Roosevelt ultimately succeeded where he failed. Now, looking solely at his foreign policy up to this point, you might peg him as a macho president to the bone, or highly militaristic. But in terms of domestic politics, he was actually a president with a highly reform-minded and socially progressive mindset. What President Theodore Roosevelt absolutely despised back then was the way massive conglomerates dominated and monopolized the market. A very popular term in America during that era was robber barons. It referred to the ruthless capitalists who amassed wealth by any means necessary, practically extorting others during America's explosive economic boom. People like steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, oil tycoon John Rockefeller D, and finance emperor J.P. Morgan were exactly who this meant. Theodore Roosevelt firmly believed the federal government needed to drop the hammer on these corporate monopolies. That's why in American history, he is often called by the glorious nickname, the Trust Buster. Eventually, in 1906, wielding the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Roosevelt administration filed a federal lawsuit against Rockefeller's behemoth, Standard Oil, accusing it of highly corrupt economic monopolies. This trial of the century dragged on for about 5 years, and finally, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a historic ruling. The court ruled against Standard Oil and ordered dismantle this massive corporation completely into 34 independent companies. Thanks to these sweeping anti-corporate reforms, President Roosevelt was immensely loved and supported by the public domestically. But honestly, for most of us today, when we hear Roosevelt, there is usually another president who comes to mind first, right? The man who led the nation to victory in World War II, cementing America as the undisputed strongest global superpower, and the figure who overcame the horrific Great Depression with his New Deal policies. That is the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Roosevelt clan was originally a Dutch immigrant family. Arriving in America around 1650, their roots ran deeper than almost anyone else in the country. From the early days, they possessed a sharp acumen for shipping, trade, and real estate, amassing phenomenal wealth. Leveraging that immense financial power, they entered the political arena and, as we all know, produced a staggering 2 presidents from one family. However, while both FDR and Teddy Roosevelt served as presidents, their political ideologies and party affiliations were drastically different. As you may know, FDR belonged to the Democratic Party, while Teddy Roosevelt belonged to the Republican Party. As you can guess from their last name, the two were relatives, not immediate family, but rather distant cousins. So, historians often distinguish between them based on the areas in New York where the two families lived for generations. Teddy Roosevelt's branch is referred to as the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, and FDR's branch is called the Hyde Park Roosevelts. Though distant cousins, their personal lives were intimately intertwined. FDR's wife, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, was actually President Teddy Roosevelt's own niece. Eleanor had tragically lost her parents and entire family at a young age, practically becoming an orphan, so it was her uncle, Teddy Roosevelt, who stepped in, tenderly caring for and deeply cherishing his poor niece as he raised her. In truth, while Uncle Teddy was alive, the two branches of the family seemed to get along peacefully enough, but in 1919, Teddy Roosevelt sadly passed away, and that's when the relationship between the two households began to seriously fracture. Teddy Roosevelt's eldest son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., followed in his father's footsteps and ran for governor of New York in 1924. But in a shocking twist, FDR's wife, Eleanor, a staunch Democrat, stepped onto the front lines to lead a campaign against her own first cousin. Capitalizing on the Teapot Dome scandal plaguing the Republican Party at the time, Eleanor literally carried a teapot with her on the campaign trail, ruthlessly criticizing Teddy Jr., which ultimately led to his bitter defeat. Well, while it's hard to know the exact inner workings, it seems that while Eleanor held deep affection for the uncle who raised her, her relationship with her cousins was quite icy. This incident dealt a massive blow to Teddy Jr.'s political career, and the relationship between the two branches solidified into an irreversible rivalry. It showcased the bitter reality of the political pendulum completely swinging from the historically dominant Oyster Bay faction over to the Hyde Park side. As the saying goes, there's no rivalry quite like a family rivalry, and it is known that the two families remained on parallel, non-intersecting tracks ever since. However, the part of President Theodore Roosevelt's family story that leaves behind the deepest impression is the dedication of his children. President Roosevelt was married twice in his lifetime. After his first wife tragically passed away right after giving birth to their first daughter, Alice, he remarried. He had 4 sons and 1 daughter with his second wife, and astonishingly, all 5 of these remaining children served in World Wars I and II. The one who left behind the most incredible story was the eldest son, Ted Jr., the very same man who experienced that bitter political downfall earlier. Of course, he fought in both World War I and World War II. The truth is, when he deployed for World War II, Teddy Jr. was a staggering 56 years old. On top of that, he had sustained severe leg injuries during World War I, making him a disabled veteran who normally had to rely on a cane to walk. Yet this aging veteran went to war and was directly deployed into one of the most famous military operations in history. As a brigadier general in the U.S. Army, he stood at the absolute vanguard of the fierce Normandy landings. If you look at the Normandy landings, the Allied forces had multiple landing points. Among them, he landed in the first wave at Utah Beach, the sector assigned to the Americans. Pushed off course by the ocean currents, they landed about a mile away from their target objective, but leaning on his cane, he assessed the situation and shouted to his men, "We'll start the war from right here." And with that, he limped around the artillery-blasted beach, personally commanding his troops from the front lines. But the emotional weight doesn't end there. His own son, Quentin Roosevelt II, was also risking his life at that very moment as a U.S. Army captain in the exact same Normandy operation. Later on, when General Omar Bradley, the commander of the U.S. forces, was asked, "Who was the most heroic person you remember from the war?" the anecdote of General Bradley answering without hesitation, "The Roosevelt on Utah Beach," remains incredibly famous to this day. Looking at stories like this, it seems that for America's highest-tier political elite families, there is a deep-seated tradition of Noblesse Oblige, a profound sense of duty dictating, because we enjoy so much from society, we must demonstrate our sacrifice for the nation. And this magnificent tradition is precisely why, even today, so many young American political hopefuls still see military service as a vital rite of passage. Theodore Roosevelt. From the perspective of the American people, he is firmly established and deeply loved to this day as the true leader who built a strong America. On January 6, 1919, Teddy Roosevelt passed away peacefully in his sleep due to a chronic heart condition he had been suffering from. Upon hearing the news of his father's passing, his third son, Archibald Roosevelt, reportedly sent a brief telegram to his scattered siblings. "The old lion is dead." When looking at the incredibly complex and chaotic international geopolitical landscape of today, it makes you wonder, perhaps we are entering an era that once again needs a strong, decisive, and fiercely driven leader like him.